Welcome to Faith and Freedom, an audio feature produced by the Wagner Faith and Freedom Center located on the campus of Spring Arbor University. The Wagner Faith and Freedom Center serves as the nation's academic voice for faith, family, and freedom. And now here's your host for Faith and Freedom, Professor William Wagner.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Faith and Freedom Podcast. My name is Salvatore Biondo, and as you can see, I am not your usual host, Will Wagner. Will is currently traveling out of town right now, and so he put me as the host for today. Hopefully I do a good job for you guys. Now, today we're going to be tackling a pretty serious topic. It's one that Christians have wrestled with for thousands of years, and that topic revolves around the morality of war, the morality of warfare. Now, this isn't going to be a political episode. We're not going to talk about any current conflicts, any current wars, any politicians or foreign policy. Instead, we're going to try to ask a deeper and older question, which is, can war ever be morally justified for a Christian? Now, throughout Christian history, most mainline traditions have answered that question using something called just war theory. And now, just war theory is a moral framework that tries to answer two basic questions. When is it just to go to war, and how must a war be fought if it is justified? Now, this doesn't try to glorify war. It doesn't try to make it sound like war is good. Instead, it tries to place strict moral limitations on warfare, how we start it, and how we conduct it. This way of thinking goes back to the early church, especially to early church fathers like St. Augustine, and then was later organized more clearly under the middle-aged philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Today, most Christian traditions, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, still use some form of this framework. And because different Christian groups may explain it in different ways or use different terminology, it can get kind of confusing. For today's episode, how I structured this is we're going to be walking through the steps lined out in the Catholic Catechism, especially in paragraph 2309. But I just want to reiterate that this is a shared tradition among all Christians, no matter what mainline tradition you end up coming from. So let me introduce our guest for today, because thankfully I'm not doing this episode alone. We have our current 2026 Faith and Freedom Fellow, Noah Stambaugh, and we have our two former Faith and Freedom Fellows, Kortman and McCool. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Sal.
Yeah, it'll be a fun episode. Okay, so before we get into the specific conditions laid out in the Catechism about what qualifies as a just war, I want to really emphasize where this teaching and where this tradition comes from. So just war theory, as I said, grows out of early Christian traditions, especially from the writings of St. Augustine. Now, Augustine's writing in the I believe it's the late 4th and early 5th centuries, and he's writing during the time when the Roman Empire is starting to fall, and he's getting questions from different soldiers. And we have this in his letters, like letter 138 and letter 189, where Roman soldiers and Roman politicians and even Roman generals are asking him questions. Now that we're kind of, incorporating Christianity more into our Roman Empire, how does this play out in a warfare? Can the empire defend itself? What does a just war look like? And so Augustine teaches in these letters that war is always tragic, but in a fallen world, it might sometimes be necessary to preserve innocent life and restrain evil. He emphasizes that wars must only be fought for the sake of justice and peace and never for things like hatred or revenge. And now several centuries later, you get a man named St. Thomas Aquinas who took Augustine's ideas and organized them into three core principles. He wrote that in order for a war to be just, three things are necessary: a legitimate defense, or a legitimate authority, a just cause, and the right intention. Now, the modern catechism builds directly on these same foundations laid out by Augustine and Aquinas. Now, instead of repeating those three in Aquinas' list, it gives four very strict practical conditions that all must be met if military force can be considered justified. It basically clarifies how to apply the principles of Aquinas and Augustine in our modern world. You could say that Aquinas gave the core principles, but the Catechism gives the practical tests for today. And I think it's important to understand why this question still matters. Why do we even need to talk about this? If you look at the last century, even the past couple decades, in our culture, it seems like our societies drift from one conflict to another. Sometimes they're large, sometimes they're congressional declarations of war, like we had with World War I or World War II. But oftentimes nowadays, they're more like small military strikes or operations. They might not get called a war formally, but the question remains the same that we're asking. When is it right for the state to use lethal force from a Christian perspective? And now there are two easy extremes that people fall into today. One extreme is just a clear, cold cost analysis basis of thinking, like a realpolitik. Basically, can we get more out of a war than we lose? Basically saying, we're losing human life, but do we gain more territory and do we gain more resources? And that just is incompatible with Christian theology in many cases. Now, the other extreme says that, the state is just a group of individuals. And because individuals can't go around declaring war on people, neither can the state. But that ignores the fact that governments really do have responsibilities that individuals don't, like defending the innocent, enforcing justice, and preserving peace. So just war tries to find a middle ground. It says that the state may sometimes use force, but only under very strict moral conditions. And even when a war is justified, that doesn't mean anything goes when the fighting starts. Traditionally, Christians have distinguished between a Latin phrase called jus ad bellum, which basically says that it basically translates to justice in going to war, and jus ad bello, which is justice in how a war is conducted once it's started. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the Catechism, especially in paragraph 3209, gives 4 strict conditions, basically 4 pillars, like I talked about before this can be met. And we're going to walk through all these together. So the first condition, lined out, I'm going to quote from here. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. In other words, there must be a real and serious threat to the nation, something like the destruction of innocent life, mass killings, invasion, or mass violence. Wars can never be fought for things like envy or pride or resource gain or expansion. It must be a true defense against a grave evil. And this reflects what Augustine meant when he talked about how a just war is one that avenges wrongs, when a nation refuses to correct its own injustices. So I want to open this up to discussion. What do you guys hear, when I say the phrase just cause, what comes to mind? And do you think that this is a principle that most Christians would recognize instinctively? I'll go through it one more time. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. What are kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you got to look, first off, what they're doing, right? That's what kind of just war theory says. And the problem is that we as humans might see something as terrible, when as the other people will see it as okay. So we truly do need to justify it with an outside source. And I would say that source would be the Bible, from a Christian perspective, right? So these things that people do, the reasons that we go to war, you can't just say it's because of their moral framework, right? You need to do it through the lens of the Bible. Is what they're doing so detestable by the standards set out in Scripture that you feel that your life, as well as the lives of others, are worth losing for it?
I would say I semi-disagree with that, because I think there are a lot of scenarios in which we would attribute like a just cause for a just war to happen that we don't see like direct scriptural accounts for. But I think so.
To that, there would be there's traditionally something that would relate to it.
Situationally, I think like
a biblical foundation, kind of building on that.
Yeah.
I think even if you just look at the fact that there's not a lot of scripture discussing. You can look at the Old Testament. And a lot of that's probably more under holy war, where God, caused Israel to go to war for certain reasons. But scripturally, there's not a lot of precedent for. I don't believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. For if a nation were to attack America, would we have just cause to go to war for that? Well, we'd obviously say yes, probably. I don't think there's even a lot of biblical precedents for that outside of a holy war where God kind of calls for it. You know what I'm saying? So I think in that sense, it gets you in a dangerous scenario. Obviously we would say because it saves innocent lives, but that's not something that God really, or the Bible really talks about. We see that Christians are to give their lives, even under persecution all the time. So
I think you guys are both kind of on the same strand. It's a moral framework that obviously derives in a lot of part from Scripture. I think I mean, I'm seeing agreement between you for the most part. I see the disagreement too, but
I'm not saying everything's going to have a direct quote from the Bible, but I think that through both Christian tradition as well as Scripture, I think Scripture is binding, and it's number one. But I also agree with much of Christian tradition, which I should have clarified initially.
Okay.
And I think that, as a good Wesleyan, I think that is something that's very important to note.
okay. All right, good talk. So we're going to move on to the second condition now. So the second condition, and I'm going to quote again from the Catechism, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. So that means war must be our last resort. Okay, Christians should never be eager for war. You know, Christ himself says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," right? So that means negotiation, diplomacy, sanctions, mediation. These things have to be a pretext before any idea of war is considered. And so this kind of aligns with what Augustine said when he was first discussing this in those letters I mentioned at the beginning. This is his direct quote. "Peace should be the object of your desire. War should only be waged as a necessity." So, I mean, you know, opening it up again, do you guys think that societies today still treat war as a last resort? Would you agree with that principle? And do you think that our society as a whole agrees with that in modern times?
I would say that, without getting too political, I think that a lot of times war is driven by money in our modern state, which is very unfortunate because it just completely denies what the principles that are laid out in the Catechism, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I don't want to go too deep down that because I think that it would get political. But
Sure.
I think that if you follow the money trail, you can see.
I'd agree with that. I think the interesting part too is like, I think when we look at the undertones, it generally is money derived. But there are you hear a lot of they make it out to seem like it is something that must happen.
Yeah.
So I think like over the news, you're gonna see like we had to go do this because of this, and that, and like it's gonna be like the average citizen per se who doesn't really care about politics or that stuff. It might just seem like of course we'd go to war for that. But then I want to bring up examples, but I can't. But like I would generally agree that I think the main undertones of it is either financial or power based.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hope that it would be people's last resort. I think everybody would be on board with that being a last resort. And I think now it's the easiest time ever to start wars and do that with all the equipment and all that things that we have now. That it's the easiest it's ever been to just say, yep, we're going to do this, boom, boom.
Yeah.
Instead of back even a couple hundred years ago where it would take so much work. You have to get all these people, all this effort to get something done. And now it's just the click of a button.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and to that, I remember, I don't remember what president it was, but during like nuclear stuff, they were saying, well, we want this to be harder than you just having to push a button. We're going to have a guy that we're going to set up for life if it happens, but if you want to send off the nuke, you have to kill him. It didn't go through, but that would really start to make you think about what you're doing over.
Yeah, I've never heard of that story. That's wow.
I guess this is
I
the
think
question
it was real.
too. Along that is like what do we think? Like, what is the last chance? You know what I mean? What is that last straw? Like, is it getting attacked? Is it is preemptive wrong? Especially when you get in a discussion about nation and innocent lives and things like that. Like, I think that is. I agree with the principle. I think acting on the principle can be very difficult.
Sure. Yeah. No, especially because there have been times in all wars where you'll have people say we are at immediate risk right now. This is like DEFCON 1. Like we have got to deal with this problem right away. And then sometimes that turns out, that cause, that justification that was, used, sometimes is not the case. And I think we've seen that before in plenty of wars. Okay. So I'm going to move on to pillar number 3. So the third condition that the Catechism lays out. And this one interests me because usually when you think of like a war being just, this one doesn't come to mind, at least not to my mind as much. Catechism says that, quote, there must be serious prospects of success. Basically saying that it's immoral to send people to war in a hopeless cause, just like throwing bodies at a meat grinder. It's not heroic, it's just unjust. And I found a verse in Scripture that I thought was really interesting. It's not, now this is from the Gospel of Luke, Luke 14:31 through 32. And it's not talking about war, but it's talking about the cost of discipleship. But the analogy that Christ uses is interesting to this point about the probability of success. So this is the quote from Luke 14. Or what king, on his way to war with another king, will not first sit down and consider whether he can engage with 10,000 men, the one coming against him with 20,000? And if he is unable, he will send a delegation while the other king is still far off and ask for terms of peace. I mean, I thought that was interesting. So, opening it up once again, how should Christians think about wars that are noble in cause but likely unwinnable? From like your guys' perspective, what do you guys think about that point in the Catechism?
I've kind of got two thoughts on that. Like, first off, it proves that there can never be two just wars, right? Like, or two sides thinking that their war is entirely just. But also to that, I mean, looking back to the Bible, if you believe that that what you are fighting for is entirely just, if you believe the Lord is fighting on your side, I'm not going to quote Scripture like some people have and say that Joshua 1:9 still applies, but there have been times in which the Lord has fought with people, right? In the book of Joshua, those were just wars. I mean, you would consider that they would be under the holy war ideal. But if you believe what you're fighting for is godly, God will be on your side. So this is the part of just war that I would say I'm weakest on.
I'd agree. I feel like there's a dilemma too. Like the last part of it's like I think the last part that you read off was like if there is not a good chance that if there's not a good chance that you win the war, then you sue for peace. Well, and if you're suing for peace again, then was there ever really a justification for war regardless in a way? And I think there's like a weird dilemma with that. I think kind of what Murph was saying too, like if it's a war worth fighting, if it's a just war, then I think it's a war worth dying for, is essentially what you're saying.
Okay.
And so in that sense, I would kind of disagree. I mean, I think the same thing is like, as Christians, we are called, if we were to be persecuted against, right? In America, we don't have that problem necessarily. Not in the sense that we see our apostles did and stuff, but
Sure.
I got to be willing to die for that if it's worth honoring God for, if that makes sense. If it's not worth honoring God for, then is it really worth fighting for then?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Kinda
that's
combining pillar 1 and 2 in a way.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'd sit with that. That's where I'd sit with that, I think.
It's kind of different too, like if you're going on the offense versus if you're on the defense. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
if you're acting in self-defense and you know it's unwinnable, then you have to have some sort of peace deal or something like that, rather than going on the offense knowing that you can't do anything and that you're going to be done for.
That's a good point.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because even if you have even if there is someone, I don't know, I just think the principle is interesting because even if there is some force of evil that is attacking you, like an unjust war against you, and you just have no chance whatsoever, do you throw bodies at the problem knowing you're not going to win, or do you do you sue for peace? Like you kind of said, it's an interesting question. So.
Yeah. I think in a weird way, you could look at it like this, though, we talk about, Romans 13, given to the authorities, essentially, if somebody is that dominant over you, Like, do you act as if they are your authority and just kind of give in and be like, all right, like, as long as you're not. Then again, though, I think the question comes back to, like, if it's worth fighting for, then it probably means it's something that's dishonoring to God. And do you give in to something that's dishonoring to God? If that makes sense?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I'm willing to. If I'm going to go to war, it's because I think what I'm doing is something that honors God.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'd willingly die for that, I think.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, so now we're on the final pillar, or the fourth condition. So the fourth condition, I'm going to quote again. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. So in other words, you cannot commit greater evil in trying to stop evil, right? I mean, and I think of this as, I want to give, just some, from my opinion, some examples I thought of was, in World War II, you have things like the Holocaust committed by the Nazis, and some of the worst atrocities known to man. Just because the Nazis do that, that does not then give the Allied forces excuses to commit their own war crimes. Just because the opposite side, your enemies, are committing war crimes, that doesn't give you a free ticket to go and do things too. And I think there were the firebombing of Dresden was in there, the firebombing of Tokyo, the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we can have a discussion on this because it talks about weapons of mass destruction, modern means. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to think of that. But, I just think it's important. Just because someone commits a war crime does not give us the free pass to do the same. Evil does not justify a greater evil. And so, do you guys think what do you guys think about this principle? Is it like the hardest to follow or the hardest to apply in modern warfare? What do you think of it as a whole? Agreements, disagreements?
Yeah, I would say now it's harder. I mean, it's just going to continuously get more harder or get more hard.
Difficult.
Yeah, more difficult. But, yeah, I mean, that's just as warfare evolves, as new weapons come out, I mean, it's just going to keep pushing that scale as to what we deem proportional. So it's tough. It's a very tough question to answer in the modern age. Because do you save your soldiers and just send in drones or whatever? I mean, is it worth doing that? And, saving life on your end, is that ethical? But I don't know. This is where I am really up in the air. I'm, again, not an expert on this in any means, and my opinions on this aren't even fully formed, I would say.
I think for me, I'd say, I do agree with that. The terms for it are probably different than what I think most people would think of. For me, I think ultimately war is evil inherently. So I think Murph's talking about not committing any evils during war or trying not to. I think ultimately both sides will commit evils. I just think that the bombing or the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, inherently that is evil. You basically just massacred two relatively large cities. However, did you that is evil, but did you save the lives also of, I think the invasion force is supposed to be 100,000 men from America, and then ultimately I think they thought the cost would be upwards of millions, 1 million lives, if we were to invade Japan. So it's that is an evil, I would say, but did you also stop a greater evil from happening? And I think, to me, that's what that means. Ultimately, it's about, the cost, the benefit ratio, and, am I going to sacrifice, for both sides, am I going to sacrifice 1 million people for 30,000 people? I think I'd take 30,000.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back for our final wrap.
Growing deep roots means anchoring yourself to Jesus Christ, the source of all life and learning. Here at Spring Arbor University, faith and academics work hand in hand, grounding you in truth and wisdom. With a close-knit Christian community by your side, you'll grow strong, ready to face life's challenges. At SAU, you won't just learn, you'll thrive. Grow deep roots at Spring Arbor University. Visit arbor.edu today.
Well, we've heard a lot of different perspectives, talked about a lot of different content. I've hoped you've enjoyed the episode. Basically to recap what we've said is, even when a war is justified and we apply those principles that we talked about, in seeing if it is justified, how it's fought still matters. Moral law doesn't just disappear as Christians once the war has begun. This applies for different things. Christians have always, thought of, non-combatants as, being under a protective area, prisoners treating it humanely, direct attacks on civilians being immoral. These kinds of questions come up in these discussions, and they're, useful to talk about. And as we wrap up, one thing kind of becomes clear. War is never a good thing, and a Christian should never hope for it. But sometimes it's, as the government does its duty in protecting innocent life, it has to happen. Sometimes a just war has to occur, and there are examples, I think, where that can be a just war. War is tragic, peace is the goal, but force may sometimes be necessary to protect the innocent. But like I said, even then, strict moral limits apply. So what I've hoped we've done for you all today by doing this podcast, through our agreements and our disagreements and our comments, I hope we've given you the tools to analyze current conflicts for yourselves and judge them, by these ancient Christian criteria that we've used for war for millennia. And so, if you are interested, if there is a conflict going on today that you want to look at, look up the just war criteria and analyze it for yourself and talk about it with your family and friends. And just remember that I think this is important too. The first casualty of war is always the truth. No matter what side of the conflict, we've seen this in probably every war, the truth is always the first to go. And whether it's selective truth or whether it's outright lies, one side or the other is going to try to get them to sympathize with you. So, critical thinking, prudence in your analysis, these are the things that we need for just war criteria to apply. Thank you all for our conversation today, you and you and you, and I hope you all had fun listening. Thank you very much.